Senator Ted Cruz is leading a group of 11 senators who will object unless a commission is named to investigate allegations of fraud. Senator Ted Cruz joins me right now. Senator, great to have you this morning. Happy New Year to you. Why are you doing this, and how will this play out?
Well, good morning, Maria. Happy New Year as well. Thanks for having me. Look, we're at an extraordinary time in our country's history. We went into this election with the country deeply divided, deeply polarized, and we've seen in the last 2 months unprecedented allegations of voter fraud. And that's produced a deep, deep distrust of our democratic process across the country. I think we in Congress have an obligation to do something about that. We have an obligation to protect the integrity of the democratic system. And so this past week, I spent writing out a position and assembling a group that ultimately of 11 senators that we put out yesterday that we will together object to certification in order to force the appointment of an emergency electoral commission to perform an emergency audit of the election results to assess these claims of frauds. I think we can do that. We can do it promptly. We can do it in 10 days before the inauguration. But I think we have an obligation to the voters, and we have an obligation to the Constitution to ensure that this election was lawful.
You mentioned the allegations of fraud, and in the press release announcing this commission that you'd like to see, you report on a Reuters Ipsos poll that says 39% of Americans believe the election was rigged. That belief held by Republicans, 67%, Democrats, 17%, and independents, 31%. But, Senator, we know that we heard from Bill Barr, and he said he didn't see fraud. We know that we heard from the states, and we also know that we heard from the Supreme Court, who did not hear the attacks and the cases that said there was fraud. How do you respond to that?
Well, each of those different players has a different role in our constitutional system. Bill Barr was speaking as to the evidence the Department of Justice saw. The Department of Justice wasn't administering any elections, did not have access to particularly widespread evidence on either side of the issue. As for the states, there are a lot of people in the states and state legislatures who've expressed deep, deep concerns about the unlawful practices that we saw on Election Day, that we saw particularly cities controlled by Democratic politicians shutting down the vote, throwing out observers, disregarding the law. And finally, you mentioned the Supreme Court. Listen, I wish the Supreme Court had taken this case. There were two opportunities to take this case, one out of Pennsylvania, one out of Texas. In both instances, the lawyers asked me to argue those cases. And so with regard to the Texas case, President Trump called me and said, Ted, would you do the oral argument in this case if the court takes it? I told the president, absolutely, I'd be happy to do it. I wish the court had taken one or both of those cases. I think the Supreme Court would be a better forum for resolving those issues. That obviously was the forum we resolved issues similarly in 2000 in Bush versus Gore. Unfortunately, the court declined to take those two cases, so we don't have the court stepping in to resolve it. And that's why I think Congress has a responsibility. We have an independent obligation to the Constitution. We have an independent obligation to the rule of law. And the question, look, we've got to vote on January 6th on certification. And every member of Congress faces a dilemma. Frankly, two pretty lousy choices. One, we can vote to certify, not consider any objections. If we do that, that will be heard by a lot of Americans as saying we don't think voter fraud is a real concern. We don't think these claims should be investigated thoroughly. I know that's not what most of us believe. But secondly, and I think all of us rightly don't want to be in a position where we're suggesting setting aside the results of an election just because the candidate that we supported didn't happen to prevail. That's not a principled constitutional position. That's why in assembling this group of 11 senators, I was looking for a third option, an option that was really moored in the law. And so I'll tell you what I did, Marie. I went back and looked at the historical precedents. I think the strongest precedent is the presidential election of 1876, Hayes versus Tilden. In that election, there were serious allegations of fraud in 3 different states, in Florida, in Louisiana, and in South Carolina. And what did Congress do in 1876? Now, they didn't throw up their hands and say, well, gosh, we've got allegations of fraud, but we can't do anything about it. We've just got to certify. No, they didn't do that.
Yeah.
What they did instead is they appointed a commission. It was called an electoral commission, consisted of 5 House members, 5 senators, 5 Supreme Court justices. They considered evidence, they examined the ballots, and they made a determination based upon what the disputed ballots and what the outcome should be. What I'm arguing for is Congress ought to do the same thing. We ought to have a fair inquiry, a fair audit into these results, and we ought to resolve these claims, not just dismiss them out of hand.